event occurred in this century which was quite startling. A young man was cruelly maltreated by soldiers. Before he was hanged, he made an effort to hold himself up with one free hand, and loosening the rope around his neck, he shouted, "Long live Christ the King." His mother told the soldiers that she had 3 other sons whom she was willing to offer to her God. This is heroism on the level of Roman persecutions in the early years of the church. It happened right in North America, in Mexico, in the 1920s. I'm Julius Smetona. You're watching What Catholics Believe. Today we're going to continue our discussion on the Cristeros. The situation in Mexico is remarkable. It was remarkable for several things: that a violently anti-Catholic government could become established in a country which was 97% Catholic. And it was remarkable for the heroism of the Catholics who defended their faith in the face of such persecutions. With me today to continue our discussion of the Cristeros are the following guests: Father Clarence Kelly, Spiritual Director of St. Joseph's Novitiate in Round Top, New York, a congregation of traditional Catholic sisters; Mr. Jose Lupe Atilano, a parishioner of Father Marachka's at St. Anne's Church in White Bear Lake, Minnesota; and Father William Jenkins, pastor of St. Teresa the Child Jesus Church in Parma, Ohio. I'd just like to bring 1 or 2 more episodes before our viewers to give them a flavor for what kind of things we were witnessing in those days. Here it speaks of 2 young men were murdered at Zamora, Michoacan. And they were compelled to shout, "Long live Calles." He was the dictator of Mexico who had a bitter hatred of the Catholic Church. Instead, they shouted, "Long live Christ the King." The soldiers began to cut off their ears, and having obtained no better results, these men were still yelling, "Long live Christ the King," they cut off their tongues. And then they finally killed the 2 young men. There was tremendous persecution of priests. Often they were hunted down and shot. It was against the law to say Mass. It was against the law, even in many instances, to pray in your own home. One woman was captured so that she might inform where the rector of a church and some Catholics were hidden. As she refused, the soldiers began to tear off her fingers. The mutilation continued until she became exhausted. They then finally killed her, but she never betrayed the priest. Another example was again remarkable. Father Sabas Reyes from Tolotlan, Jalisco, was shot, but before he died, he was submitted to terrific torments. He was asked to tell where his pastor was hidden, and having refused, he was dragged along to the porch of the parish church. He was tied up against one of the columns in such a way that his feet could not rest upon the floor. The military chief and soldiers began to pinch him with their swords and bayonets. During 3 days, he was maintained in that condition, exposed to the sun's rays as well as to the cold at night, and with no food. Finally, the skin of his feet was removed. These were soaked with gasoline and burned out. He was then compelled to walk to the cemetery where he was shot. And even one more example. Anselmo Padilla was captured. The soldiers cut off his nose and made several cuts in his face because he refused to cheer for Calles and shouted, "Long live Christ the King." When he was almost exhausted, they tore off the skin off his feet and compelled him to walk upon fire. He died immediately afterwards. One could come up with example after example of such heroism. Jose Lupe, how did such a situation ever arise in Mexico, which was such a Catholic country and which had such an overwhelming Catholic majority?
Well, you know what hatred can do towards men when hatred is possessed by some human beings. And unfortunately, we had a perfect example what hatred can do here in Mexico. You just gave just a few of 1,000 typical cases. This was an everyday thing in Mexico.
Mm-hmm. You know, again, people tend to forget, and I believe that Mexico was overshadowed by her neighbor to the north, the United States, but before 1800 it was the other way around. Mexico had a remarkable civilization, remarkable artistic accomplishments, remarkable literacy. The first universities in North America were established in the 1500s in Mexico, and their faculty members were native Indians. What do you make of the charge that the church was responsible for poverty in Mexico?
I think that it's a typical trumped-up charge by the spiritual or ideological descendants of the ones who caused all the damage and all the problems. Wherever the Catholic Church went, no matter where it was, not only did the Catholic Church bring the true faith in Jesus Christ, but the Catholic Church brought civilization, brought education, brought hospitals, raised the standard of living from an economic point of view and also from a social point of view, a cultural point of view. There's just no question about it, and that is why Mexico prospered the way it did, why it towered over so many other countries. And then when you get the socialists, the communists, and the Masons, and the liberals who destroy the influences of Catholicism, you have a degradation on every level, including the economic level. And what typically has happened is that the terrible, let's say, financial, sociological situation of Mexico today is the direct result of liberalism. Just as the problems, for example, behind the Iron Curtain, the economic disasters, direct result of liberalism and socialism and communism. The great problem in the world today is liberalism, modernism, socialism, and communism. And that is why we should let that left-wing Nazi system, for that is what it is, just international socialism. Nazism is national socialism. Communism is international socialism. We should let that corrupt and dying colossus simply collapse. And we should not be running to their aid, and let the people then build some decent civilization on the carcass of communism.
Father Jenkins.
Despite all the propaganda to the contrary, it is a fact, an historical fact, that wherever the Catholic Church sank her roots, through the faith, the native populations experienced a great upsurge of prosperity and peace. A very beautiful example of that is one which is very little known, and it is very little known by design. That is, those who write the history books now and those who are teaching in the universities and colleges and high schools in this country don't go in for this kind of factual reporting. But if one looks at the reductions in South America, were established there by the colonizing powers of Europe back in the 16 and 1700s, you'll find that the native populations there were enjoying a tremendous prosperity and peace, such as they had never known before. The church brought the faith, and the priests went to the people, and the Catholic Church's purpose was always to take the faith to the people, establish the faith in the hearts of the native populations, and then let them take over. Let them become the priests. Let them become the bishops. The people wanted their own native priests and bishops, and that's what the church always tried to give them. The reductions in Paraguay, which were the great Catholic missions, were extremely prosperous, too prosperous. That was the problem, because the Masons in the governments of Spain and France and Portugal did not want the native populations to free themselves so well. They wanted the Masonic powers that were imported from Europe to maintain control over the population. And they wanted to enslave the Indian populations of the South American countries. And so what they did was actually, I'm talking about the Masonic influence in the crown governments of Europe. They actually had laws passed against the Catholic missions in these countries, so that the Catholic missions could no longer enable the native Indian populations to enjoy prosperity and to arm themselves and be able to defend themselves against the Masons who wanted to enslave them. And finally, those missions were crushed, not by hostile native populations. Those missions were crushed by the most Christian kings, so-called, of Europe operating under Masonic prime ministers. And what happened after the Catholic missions were gone? The natives were enslaved. Often they were massacred. And finally there were Masonic governments installed over countries that had broken free from their colonizing countries in Europe, but they were directly under the thumb of the Masons. And as soon as that happened, the Masons began exploiting them, trying to destroy the faith in their hearts, and every single one of those nations experienced a tremendous downturn in its standard of living.
You know, it's interesting if we could just go back to Mexico. A very similar situation happened. The so-called liberators of the people became the richest men in the country, like President Calles, who owned incredible wealth. The abuse that was felt by the people as a result of the suppression of the church was incredible. For instance, you couldn't do anything if you were a Catholic. Well, who ran the hospitals? Most of the nurses were nuns. As a result, they lost all their hospitals. Who taught the children? Priests and nuns. What happens when they forbade them to taught? You had total lack of education. Again, I'd like to quote from an oath that any teacher had to take under this revolutionary Mexican government. I declare that I am an atheist, an irreconcilable enemy of the Catholic, Apostolic, and Roman religion, that I will endeavor to destroy it, detaching consciences from the bonds of any religious worship, and that I am ready to fight against the clergy anywhere and everywhere it will be necessary. In fact, they wanted the children to begin the day by saying there is no God. And in fact, they further tried to replace the expression adios, which Dios is God and a is with God, by something saying like health. And this is how fanatical they were. But Mr. Tilano, if you could get back to this, how... I understand that by 1929, the Cristeros had taken up arms. They were very heroic, and they were close to actually unseating the government. Do you recall any particularly memorable battles?
Oh, yes, Julius. There's one very particular battle that I learned from a living Cristero, Mr. De Anda, that I mentioned in another program. I talked to this gentleman August of 1991, went to his own home and interviewed him. And he told me of this battle in his hometown, which is San Julian, located in the state of Jalisco, central Mexico. Actually, there were 3 Catholic people that were giving the government a hard time. This was Bishop Ruiz, Mr. a lay person whose last name is, his first name, excuse me, is Victoriano, but nicknamed 14, and another lay person, Mr. Hernandez. And so the government sent 480 troops from Mexico City to wipe out this little town, which is under the name of San Julian, very strong Catholic town, population of probably 5,000 people. And it was really 480 well-armed troops were very, very capable easily to wipe out this town, to wipe out whatever Cristeros were there. Well,
is this the gentleman on the screen who told you about it?
Yes, this is Mr. Hernandez. Okay. Yes, and he told me just recently about this battle, and he was involved in it. Anyway, he lost half of his hand, as you see there. He lost half of his hand. Is another battle that I'll probably talk to about later, but.
What about this battle where all these troops came?
Okay, these troops came in search of Cristeros to San Julian. This is the little town. And there were probably, I figured, 50 or 60 Cristeros putting resistance there. And they were advised that the enemy was approaching. And so they got prepared for the battle. So at first, the Cristeros started losing ground. And matter of fact, the the general from the government, which was his last name is Rodriguez, told his troops that we have an easy win here, and if you people, you my soldiers, wipe out this town of any Cristeros, I'm going to give you my consent to go and abuse sexually any women you want, as many as you want, and kill any innocent people. So, well, to his surprise, it came not really, see, because yes, the Cristeros were getting weaker, but in the meantime, another leader was informed that his people were perishing. So this is Mr. Hernandez. So he rushed with his troops, which were only like 10 miles away, and fought face to face with the government, and it was a victorious battle. I believe that out of those 480 government troops, if there were 40, they escaped alive. There were many. There were too many. However, the general, Mr. Rodriguez, he escaped. How? He went and dressed himself as a woman. He probably stole a skirt or a veil from some woman, and that's how he escaped it. He left his hat and all his outfit behind.
Did he say something about the intervention of Christ?
Oh yes, matter of fact, this first this General Rodriguez, thinking that this was going to be an easy battle. And when he started feeling that resistance is tougher than what he thought, actually a lot of his troops were started being killed, he thought, this is unexplainable, I cannot understand. It must be some kind of divine intervention here helping these people. I mean, he as a Masonic started to believe that there was supernatural help. In the meantime, Bishop Ruiz was praying very, very dearly for his faithful.
You're watching what Catholics believe. You know, the point I'd like to get to is 1929. It seems that in spite of these tremendous religious persecutions, the United States government would not withdraw its recognition of the Mexican government, the revolutionary government. In fact, it had set up border patrols to ensure that no arms would reach the Cristeros during the late 20s. And what's perhaps inexplicable is that elements within the Vatican were very much opposed to armed resistance. Many suspect that the Secretary of State, Cardinal Gaspari, had something to do with this. Pope Pius XI was a great champion of the Cristeros. He wrote of them as follows in an encyclical entitled Iniquis Afflictisque. He said as follows: with rosary in hand and the cry Viva Cristo Rey on their lips, these young students are going voluntarily to their deaths. What a spectacle of holiness for the whole world. One of the Mexican bishops who was in exile, according to Father Parsons wrote a book called Mexican Martyrdom, where he documents the events between 1926 and 1935, and it's available from TAN. He recognized that the problem was not merely defeating the Calles government on the field of battle. He knew that the U.S. government would come to the support of Calles if trouble developed. How can you explain, Reverend Fathers, I'd like to direct this to you, the fact that when it seems from many indications that the Cristeros were about to throw the atheists out, the Vatican arranged or negotiated an agreement with the Calles government, and Dwight Morrow, the U.S. ambassador, who was supportive, believe it or not, of the government. They arranged this agreement, and it involved the Cristeros putting down their arms, and in fact, under pain of sin, they were not to resist the government. How did this happen? I mean, the consequence was a clear disaster, but why would they even conceive of such a thing?
It's a very difficult thing to figure out. When you look into history, you see so many things, events have occurred which are inexplicable. This is one of those things. Was it a matter of them not really understanding what was going on there? Did they have a lack of information? Did they have bad information? Did they really believe that in making this compromise that perhaps they were even helping the people? It's very hard to put a specific cause on it. Were there Masonic influences, for example, even in the Vatican? You know, why do good men sometimes make bad judgments, the consequences of which have awful, awful effects? Instead of, you know, in the light of history, certainly they should have encouraged that defense of the Catholic faith against these Masonic influences. But you could also say, for example, why in 1773 did, I believe it was Clement XV, why did he suppress the Jesuits? The Jesuits stood as the bulwark against the Revolution and against Freemasonry. If the Jesuits had not been suppressed then, it is not inconceivable that the entire history of Western civilization would have been different. But the Masons in very powerful positions in European governments spread all kinds of terrible lies about the Jesuits. They pressured the kings, and they in turn pressured the Vatican, and they did indeed suppress the Jesuits. It was a terrible thing. Influences in Spain, in Portugal, against the Jesuits, it's incomprehensible.
Father Jenkins?
Well, Clement XIII was under an enormous amount of pressure from the crowned heads of Spain, Portugal, and France to suppress the Jesuits. But he realized that this pressure was coming from the enemies of the Church, because it was not the Bourbon kings who were the source of this problem. It was their Freemasonic ministers of state who were pressing them, who were trying to convince the kings that the Jesuits were the source of disturbances within their countries. But when Clement XIV was elected, it is said to a certain extent through the influence of these Freemasonic elements in governments. Clement XIV was a man who was willing to do business with the Freemasons indirectly. And he was pressured. He was pressured, there's no question, into suppressing the Jesuits because he felt it was the lesser of two evils. But the consequences were disastrous. Thousands and thousands of very loyal, truly Catholic priests were left to face certain death at home or death by starvation in exile. There are those who think that bad information and pressure teamed up to drive Pope Pius XI to determine that it was the lesser of two evils to suppress the Cristeros. For example, Mary Martinez, in her fascinating book, The Undermining of the Catholic Church, which she wrote in Mexico, by the way, and had printed there. She's still there. She writes about this period we're talking about now with Mr. Atalano, about the persecution of the Church and the rising of the Cristeros to defend her. And she indicates in there that it was due to bad advice, filtered news that was going back to the Vatican, which prompted Pope Pius XI to make this very difficult decision to tell the Cristeros to lay down their arms. The Mexican government, remember, was also feeding the Vatican with information, very deceitful information, with regard to their part in this and how the Cristeros were being insurrectionists. And unfortunately, it seemed that the Vatican Secretary of State and others believed what the Calles government was saying. I had a history professor from a Mexican university tell me a few years ago that the Cristeros were actually given passes, safe conduct passes by the Calles government to lay down their arms and to return to their homes. And they were assured that if they did that, they would be granted amnesty. And this history professor said that when the Cristeros returned to their train stations in their home villages and presented these safe conduct passes, they were taken out behind the train station and immediately executed by the Calles government soldiers. They were ruthless, ruthless people. I think it's interesting to quote from the book Mexican Martyrdom by Father Wilfred Parsons, the Jesuit priest who wrote about this period from 1926 to 1935 in Mexico. He describes the scene. He says, little by little, the churches were closed and the priests dispersed. He says a young American in Mexico for his health later wrote of a scene that he said he would never forget as long as he lived. somewhere in the state of Chihuahua, he was invited to be present at an actual Mass, which was to be said behind barred doors. Early in the morning, with a guide, he made his way to a certain house, pushed the door open, and soon found himself in a room that had been transformed into a chapel. It was a time when it was a penal crime, as it still is, to say or hear Mass in that state. And a few minutes before 6, the front door opened, and a little old man with all the appearances of the typical Mexican house servant entered. With him was a small boy. They were the 80-year-old priest and his altar boy. Finally, when the candles had been lighted, the doors and windows securely bolted, and the priest had changed his street clothing for the vestments, Mass began. As he knelt there, the American could not help but think of all the people in the state who could not hear Mass and who had not heard it for 2 or 3 years, and who might not for many years to come. Would their faith hold out? It had not in England. With those conditions in penal days, the present state of Mexico had such striking resemblances. And he resolved to tell the story of Mexico everywhere, so that the power of world public opinion might force the rulers of Mexico to abate their persecution. But world public opinion was not allowed to react.
You've been watching What Catholics Believe. We need your support.